Thank you everyone for coming to join us. And of course I want to especially thank Ambassador Romualdez for being here. He is actually featured on the cover of our current July issue. So we're especially grateful that he's graciously now sat in the hot seat for us twice. So we certainly appreciate that. As Victor mentioned, the ambassador himself is very familiar with the media, having been the CEO of Stargate Media Corporation and publisher of People Asia magazine, which is an affiliate of the well-known Philippine Star. That media savvy will especially come in handy, not only because this is the ambassador's first diplomatic posting, but because he has the very difficult job of speaking for and oftentimes defending a controversial boss who has been described as the Donald Trump of the East. To even say that Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte is controversial is in and of itself a bit of an understatement. President Trump's blunt talk pales in comparison to some of the statements that his Philippine counterpart has made. We're going to be equally blunt in describing some of them. Among other things, President Duterte has called former President Obama a son of a whore. He proudly admitted to using Viagra and ordered his soldiers to. I think the microphone was like haven't heard these words. And ordered his soldiers to shoot female communist rebels in their vaginas. And just the other day, he even insulted God and sparked a clash with the country's powerful Catholic Church. But it's his rhetoric on drugs in particular that has generated the most headlines. The president has repeatedly vowed to slaughter anyone who uses and sells drugs, pledging, for example, to dump all drug traffickers in Manila Bay. But his harsh words have been matched by action as he wages an aggressive campaign against drugs that, according to Human Rights Watch, has killed 12,000 people since he took office. At the same time, though, this tough talk, coupled with the president's reputation as the gun-toting, tough-on-crime mayor of Davao City, is precisely what got him elected. Despite the Philippines' robust economic growth, many in this nation of just over 100 million are fed up with corruption, red tape, and crime. That includes drug violence, which is a particularly sensitive issue for many Filipinos who want a no-nonsense leader that gets things done. So despite the outrage he has stirred abroad, President Duterte still has strong support at home. In fact, a poll earlier this year found his public approval ratings to be the highest on record since such polls began in the 1980s, with nearly 80% of the population satisfied with his performance. In many ways, this parallels President Trump and the enduring popularity he has with his own base. The two leaders, in fact, have formed a sort of kinship, and they certainly enjoy a better relationship than the one President Duterte had with Barack Obama. But U.S.-Philippines relations remain complicated. America went to war with the Southeast Asian nation at the turn of the 20th century to prevent its independence, which wasn't granted to the country until 1946. This history of occupation has made many Filipinos wary of America's military presence in the region. At the same time that President Duterte has to balance his relations with the U.S., he also has to manage a rising China that itself has grand ambitions on the region. Beyond all of these geopolitical calculations and crazy rhetoric are the bread and butter issues that many Filipinos care about and that the president has pledged to address, such as corruption, poverty, and job growth. So before we get to all of that, let me, that's messing with the microphone. Ambassador, I want to start with the most obvious and toughest question for many of us, which is simply, how do you go about defending statements that many people would find incredibly offensive?
Well, it is difficult sometimes, to say the least, but you know, we have a president that has always been known to say what he wants to say. Mm-hmm. And he has, on many occasions, even during the elections, has used the cuss words and everything else. And he says that I can't change. This is me, and I'm going to be me. And he even said that I'll try my best to metamorphosize, the right word for it, So having said that, I think he gets very emotional with a lot of issues, particularly when it comes to corruption and crime. And when that thing comes into play, he just blurts out whatever he feels is the only language that people understand when he's trying to fight a very evil scourge in the Philippines. And I think people should know that we have over 1 million, or even more than that. This is just a very conservative figure of about 1 million more drug users in the Philippines. And a lot of people in government, local officials that is, and even police officers are involved in drugs. This is something similar to what probably happened in a country like Colombia, where we all know it was also in a situation that is similar to ours. So the only way that we can explain the president's words is because he gets very angry, he gets very emotional, and yes, you did mention about his problem with President Obama in the past because of before he even got to meet President Obama, there was already a lot of talk about that he was going to be lectured on human rights, which he felt was, again, not fair, only because there was no real
Good old-fashioned microphone.
Much better. Yes. So as I said, the president has had that problem with President Obama because of human rights issues that he was going to be lectured on. It was actually blurted out of emotion, which he tried to make up for when he met President Obama in Laos for the ASEAN APEC meeting. But that didn't work well either. I guess President Obama was already was not quite happy with what, as he described it, this colorful language. But all that is all behind us now, and I think that the situation between the Philippines and the United States, particularly with the relationship we have with President Trump, his relationship with President Trump, is at its best right now.
And I want to follow up, very quickly on some of the statements, and before we move on, this is obviously also an issue that we're dealing with here in the U.S. Many in the U.S. have essentially said the same thing about President Trump, even those within his own administration, which is basically not to read too much into his tweets, etc. But words do matter, especially when they carry the weight of the presidency. And obviously, for me as a woman, for example, it's difficult to overlook some of the president's comments in terms of, rapes and murders and so forth. Granted, he's apologized for some of these words, but at what point do these statements cross a certain line? Are you concerned that this talk reflects poorly on Philippine society as a whole, given the international headlines? And do you feel it's eroding any basic sense of civility and decency that we have left in politics? And obviously this is a problem we're facing as well.
Well, I always believe that a president becomes president because he is a product of his time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the Philippines, I can safely say that President Duterte is a product of his time. This is his time. This is a situation where a lot of young people are sick and tired of the old kind of politics. Many years after what we had, the People Power Revolution in 1986, nothing has changed. Same people, same players, same corruption, same inept government officials. So all of them just banded together, and believe it or not, technology played a major role in this. And this is probably what's happening here in the country, here in the United States today. People just want to have just change, and these presidents, your leader and our leader in the Philippines, are just a product of what people, the frustrations that they have, things that they want to say themselves, they can't say, and now they have somebody who's saying it for them.
Right. Now you had mentioned, I wanted to follow up, you had mentioned about that there are 1.4 million drug users in the Philippines, out of a population of just over 100 million. So, you know, a question, I mean, in the meantime, poverty affects roughly a little less than a quarter of the population. About 1 in 10 young people don't go to school. I mean, there's obviously criticism. Is the government expending too many resources focusing on the drug problem at the expense of other issues?
Well, it goes hand in hand. Poverty and drugs sort of like go hand in hand in the Philippines. All of these drugs, these are all chemical drugs that are available for these young people, and they get into it because there's nothing else for them. So it's a two-pronged program that the Philippine government has launched. We're, of course, the crime situation in the Philippines has gone so high that people couldn't walk in the streets, and some children wouldn't go to school because of the crime situation, especially in many parts of the country. So I think the program of the government now is to have more funds for education, which has always been there, but they're putting it in education and educating people about the drugs. But crime has substantially decreased over the past year. In fact, there's a street in Metro Manila where for many years people could not even go out of their houses anytime after dark. But you hear people actually saying that for the first time they can actually walk around up to midnight or even late at night, early in the morning, without fear of getting mugged or even killed.
All right. Now, on that note, let's switch gears to the war on drugs that is taking place. You know, as you well know, Human Rights Watch estimates that about 12,000 drug suspects have been killed as a result of this war or battle, including the high-profile deaths of teenagers and a South Korean businessman. And you have talked about crime going down. And what is the government's reaction not only to these figures, but also what statistics do you have in terms of the number of people killed, and then also any general figures of levels of crime since the president took office and began his crackdown?
Well, first of all, I think the 12,000 that you mentioned is bloated, because this is an accumulation of many, not necessarily related to drugs. As I said, crime in the Philippines, especially in the urban areas, was very high. So even deaths that were not really related to drugs, but perhaps into robbery, theft, with murder, and even crimes against in household crimes that they call it. So all of these figures are just collated into one. But the figures that we have are a little more than 6,000 over the past year and a half. And mind you, this was a drug war, and it was a combination of the people who were using or were involved with it, the drug users that were caught with it, and also the drug lords, and also police officers who were involved in drugs, and they were trying to knock off all of this so-called drug peddlers or people, informants. And so President Duterte has already actually dismissed 90 police officers over the past year, and there are many more that are already being investigated, and they were all involved in drugs.
So that was leading into my next question. So obviously there have been documented cases of extrajudicial killings. There are allegations that police have shot innocent people or those who weren't actually resisting arrest. So I did want to follow up. I mean, what is the government doing to investigate these allegations? And also, how do you respond to international calls that an independent UN investigation should be set up?
Well, I think the government is very displeased with the fact that they are coming in with already a sort of like ordained idea that this extrajudicial killings actually took place. Our Foreign Affairs Secretary has gone to Geneva, I think twice, and has already proposed that a new team that is totally unbiased, in his view, in our view, that they can come and investigate all these so-called extrajudicial killings. There's also a lot of political motivation behind all of this. There's no question that we have a number of people in the Philippines who would like to take back power. They lost it and they want to get it back, and so they're also sort of like putting fire into this whole issue. But I think in the end, the investigations that will be launched or is already ongoing will show that there could have been extrajudicial killings, but not sanctioned by the government. But this was actually done by, again, the police officers who were themselves involved in drugs.
Now, what? So we've talked a lot about the killings that have taken place. You know what? And you've given some anecdotal evidence. You know, the president has now been in power two years almost. So what has happened? And obviously, he earned a reputation. He was a long-time mayor in Davao City. So can you give us an idea of the levels of crime in terms of homicides, murders, robberies? You know, what has been accomplished since he took office? And perhaps some examples of the time that he was mayor for all those years.
Well, one thing for sure, in the city of Davao, before he became mayor, the crime rate was something like roughly maybe for every, we're looking at an everyday figure of about maybe close to 100 theft, robbery, murders. Right. And he brought it down. Shootouts and whatever. And he was able to bring it down to 0. And the city prospered. It had a 9% growth continuously for the past 10 years that he was actually mayor for 20 years. So this is his whole plan as far as the national level is concerned. So when he ran for president, he said that what he did for Davao, he will do for the Philippines. And he has put that into place, and he continues to do so, although, as you can see, there's already been a lesser concern about this issue because it sort of like has stabilized to a certain extent. I think we have now better police officers involved. We're working with the United States in terms of investigating drug cases. We're sharing intelligence. And what's important here that we have to note is that the war in Marawi, which is happening in the south in the Philippines, clearly shows the correlation between drugs and terrorists. It took almost 6 months for the Philippine government forces to finish that war in Marawi, and it was by accident. It was actually a drug bust that turned out to be a group that was ISIS-leaning terrorist groups, and they were using that city, Marawi, and they were planning to spread out into the other parts of the Philippines and even in Southeast Asia. There are even foreigners involved in it. So, again, you can see that this is really a problem that is international in nature, and I think the United States has seen that, and that's why we're working very closely with them now. That's one of the things that keeps us busy here in Washington, D.C. We're keeping that information and all this stuff that we have to do in fighting both the terrorists and the drugs, which is, there's a correlation, a very strong correlation between those two.
So now on that note, so the siege that took place in Marawi, which is in the island of Mindanao. So last year the government imposed martial law over the island after the Islamic State took over parts of the Muslim majority city. Since then, President Duterte has declared the siege over, the city liberated. But obviously, as you mentioned, the Islamic State is still a huge concern, especially for the Philippines as the fighters increasingly become displaced from Iraq and Syria. So can you talk to us a bit about what the government is doing specifically to flush out that group, but also in general to tackle Islamic extremism?
Well, it's a combination of our armed forces now working closely in rehabilitating the area. And again, we're working with the international community in rehabilitation of Marawi. But also, we have a lot of youngsters or young people who are actually indoctrinated into that. And there are about 200 of them that are still out there. And these are the people that are obviously being hunted down. But the more important thing really is the rehabilitation of the city, and to try and make that as a model for the other places, that there is a better alternative than going into the extremist type of thinking. This is the challenge that we now have, and we're very pleased that the United States and many other countries have come to help the Philippines in trying to overcome this major problem that we have.
Now, and there was also, on a different note, but also religious, there was the recent clash with the country's Catholic Church, and the Philippines is overwhelmingly, predominantly a Catholic country. The president called God stupid, and he has, accused the church of hypocrisy. So, are you concerned about these possible religious tensions and the schism between the president and the Catholic Church, which is, a vocal critic of his war on drugs and obviously a powerful presence in the country?
Well, the president very early on related to, in an interview actually, that he was actually sexually abused by a Jesuit priest when he was going to school at the Ateneo, which is a Jesuit school in Davao. And I think that's one of the things that he has stuck with him all his life, and he has mentioned it on many occasions, and that's why he called many priests or the Catholic Church as hypocritical, because they teach you to be good and to do this, but then he was a victim. And of course, there's a lot of cases that happen all over the world.
Problem, right.
And unfortunately, the priest who did that died, so there could never be justice for that. But he's always been saying this, that the church has been, because we have supposedly a separation of church and state, and yet the church has played a major role in sometimes removing a president in the Philippines. So I think that he made it clear that he's not going to allow something like that. Now the comment about God, we're all Catholics, we're all very sad that he said that, but again, it was really out of the emotion that he comes out of him whenever he talks about the abuses and the hypocrisy of the church, and he's very much into population control, which the church is very much against. Of course, the Pope. In the Philippines, fortunately, we have a population growth of about 1.8%. So we have about easily about 1.5 million or 1.2 million people that have added into the population. So our growth, our economic growth, is having a hard time catching up with the population. And finally, we were able to pass the reproductive health bill, which will allow the government to give out condoms as a start for families, which the church is very much against. So this is really where the real issue is, in terms of the church coming in too strong, and the government here that's trying to manage the population, trying to sort of like saying that while there's a lot of poverty, he would like to see the church play a more active role instead of having the poor just coming to church and pray, because he says prayer is not going to give you a better life. You have to do something about yourself. He said that publicly on many occasions. And of course, I know that issue about God, there is now a dialogue that will take place very soon between the church and the Philippine government, And I think it just really stems from the fact that there is this issues that are being thrown to the church that they have not done their part in the development of the Philippines.
Now you mentioned a part of the president's past, which he's discussed, which is very personal. I want to talk about his past, and we'll move on from this, but on the opposite end of the spectrum, the president has also, openly bragged about personally killing suspected criminals, including 3 while he was mayor. I mean, point blank, has this president committed murder, or is this part of his tough talk approach?
Well, personally, I think it was just tough talk, because on several occasions he says that I say that because I want to really give a message to the criminals that I'm ready to shoot them myself. But I think there's no real evidence to show that he himself, well, he was involved when he was mayor into a raid into a, I think, I'm not sure whether it was a drug den but it was it happened many years ago, where he described that the criminals were fighting back the police officers, and so he himself got involved in it when he was the mayor. So maybe he probably was referring to that when he himself, but it was actually a shootout between police officers and the crime syndicate.
And do you feel that these types of statements, especially in the media, overshadow the more compassionate work that the president has done, such as helping victims in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, which things like that don't get as much attention?
Well, like I said, every leader has his way of trying to call attention to the issues. And as you said, President Trump himself has done things like that, and recently with this immigration problem that you have in the southern border. Everybody's got his style, and I think President Duterte has used that kind of image, the tough talk, to really show that he's very serious, and just to show you that the corruption in the Philippines has subsided, not very much, but I'm just saying that people now are very careful, because he just removed a cabinet official who was a personal friend of his, who just was suspected of taking money from a foreign donor of fire trucks, and he kicked him out right there and then in the cabinet meeting. And that message came across very strongly. A lot of people appreciated that, and they felt that he was very serious about going after corruption too, going against criminals.
Right. So, obviously, President Trump and President Duterte have formed a strong relationship, and as you said, they found common cause on issues such as drugs and terrorism, but there has been disagreement on the issue of immigration, which, just as your president has made the war on drugs a centerpiece of his agenda, obviously President Trump has made cracking down on immigration a fight of his presidency. So, in terms of, Philippines has one of the largest diasporas in the world. I think there are an estimated 3.4 million Filipinos who've overall successfully integrated into the U.S. How concerned are you about the president's crackdown on immigration, the stalemate in terms of the Dreamers program, which will affect a good amount of Filipinos? And just in general, what messages are you conveying to Congress and to the White House on immigration as it pertains to the Philippines?
Well, I'm very pleased to note that many of the people in the U.S. Congress that I've met, senators and congressmen, are very, they are actually very proud to have large Filipino communities in their area.
Hawaii is
Hawaii, as far as Alaska, and in many parts of the United States, we have a lot of successful Filipinos here. They're hard workers. We have a very good image here, and I tell that to the Filipino community that we have a very good image in this country. We're not troublemakers. They come here, they work hard, they assimilate into the system, and so we're hanging on to that image that we have. We have a lot of successful Filipinos in this country, successful doctors here in Washington, D.C., in Maryland, and we've had several meetings with people like Senator Hirono of Hawaii, who's in the immigration committee in the U.S. Congress, and they sympathize with many of these things. But at the end of the day, these laws have to be done by the U.S. Congress and the American people. And obviously, we can only do so much. And our President Duterte has said that if they have broken the laws and they are up for deportation, then they should come back to the Philippines. We're not compelled to fight it for them. In other words, he's one of those, if you've broken the law of a country, then you have to respect it.
Now, beyond immigration, obviously there are very long-standing military ties between the U.S. and the Philippines. In May, U.S. and Philippine forces held annual military exercises, and Philippine officials have praised this long-standing treaty alliance with the U.S. But the President Duterte has also mentioned scaling back the presence of U.S. troops in the country for counterterrorism operations, and in the past, at least, has threatened to cancel these joint military drills. So can you give us an update on where U.S.-Philippine military relations stand at the moment?
I think it's at its best right now. Mm-hmm. We just came back from, we had a high-level meeting in Hawaii with the U.S. Pacific Command, which is now known as the Indo-Pacific Command. And we had a very good briefing. We had a very good discussion with the Admiral Harris, who now is the ambassador to South Korea. But our relationship with the military, our military relationship is one of it's one of the tightest, if I can say so. We have a lot of military officers who are trained here in the United States. I think that will continue. The scaling back was more of an offshoot of many of the things that happened in the past, which is all over now, and we're now moving forward. We know that this military alliance is very important for both the United States and the Philippines, so we're working very hard to make sure that stays that way. And we all know that we have a problem with some of our neighbors, and making some of these islands into military bases. We obviously can't talk about what may happen, but one of the things that's clear is that I think the United States will play a major role, will have to play a major role, because in the past administration, it was actually, those reefs were actually dismissed as just rocks by high State Department officials. Well, those rocks are now military bases. And it was the United States at that time kept saying that we don't get involved in bilateral issues or bilateral disputes. Well, today it has to get involved because obviously China is coming in very strong in that part.
So obviously that's the neighbor that is really building up these rocks. So, you know, it's been difficult, I think, for some people to gauge President Duterte's views on China. Shortly after he took office, he largely put aside an international tribunal ruling that actually sided with the Philippines over China in some of the territorial disputes taking place in the South China Sea. But he's also pursued closer relations with his Chinese counterpart, especially on the economic front. But even more recently, he has said that the Philippines would go to war if China is exploiting the natural resources of the South China Sea. So can you describe to us what is, in general, the president's approach toward Beijing and its ambitions in the region?
Well, just to recall or go back a little bit, when the dispute was at its highest, and we presented this to the arbitral tribunal at The Hague, we felt that we were going at it alone. The United States was non-committal in terms of how they were going to proceed, even if we won that case, and we did win that case. And in the meantime, China refused to talk to anyone in the government of President Aquino at that time. So there was no real communication whatsoever. Our foreign secretary was not at all welcome in Beijing. So we had a lot of back channeling that blew up in our faces. So the approach of President Duterte is we have to engage them, we have to talk to them, and we have to do this on our own, because we can't depend on the United States to fight this war if there is going to be a war, and hopefully, I don't think there will be, but we need to be able to engage the Chinese into sitting down and first and foremost talk about what is good for the two countries, and that's starting with the trade. But he has also been very clear that when the time comes, he will take up the issue of the areas where he feels they're part of Philippine territory. And I think that will be forthcoming very soon. But now the United States has seen how aggressive China has been. So there's been a lot of this activities on the Pacific Command that's been for the freedom of the seas operations. And I think that this will just have to continue for a while. China is ready to sit down with the Philippines, but we're not the only ones. You have to remember that Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, there are many other countries that are involved here. So we're also working with our ASEAN neighbors in coming out with an agreement with China.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to ask quickly two questions on the domestic front. One of the president's signature initiatives is a massive multi-billion-dollar spending program to improve the country's infrastructure, which is badly needed. Can you tell us just a little bit more briefly about this build program and how it's going so far?
Well, the government has begged about $175 billion to be spent in the next 6 to 10 years. We've already started with it. We've had several agreements signed with Japan, for instance, to finance the subway system in Metro Manila, which is badly needed. And airports and ports all over the country. Familiar with Clark Air Base and Subic Air Base. These bases are now been converted to free trade zones, and we've had the train system that will soon be built to connect Manila, and possibly Clark will be a major international airport. They're also putting that together, and many other infrastructure programs to build more roads and bridges all over the country. That it's not going to be an obstacle course anymore to go from one island to another. You can actually go through the whole thing. And our economic managers see this as the only way for the country to finally get into a kind of economic development that will benefit a majority of the people of the Philippines. It'll create a lot of jobs. It'll bring us into the 21st century, so to speak.
Now, speaking of jobs, and one final thing for those that might not be aware, the Philippines actually boasts one of the fastest growing dynamic economies in the world. The World Bank expects GDP to grow by 6.7% this year, and predicts that it will move into becoming an upper middle income country very soon. At the same time, poverty obviously remains a problem, affecting about roughly 20% of the population. So just can you talk about these two fronts of one, what do you attribute the country's economic successes to? And then conversely, what is the government doing to address poverty and this stubborn inequality gap?
Well, I think that the infrastructure program, as I said, is going to bring the country into where we want it to be. But I think the target of the government, and they've managed to bring it down by a couple of percentage point poverty levels. And they're hoping that by the year President Duterte steps down as president in 2022, we would have brought down the poverty rate to about 14 or 13, somewhere there, the latest figures. But no question about it, the growth in the Philippines, economic growth, is just phenomenal. I have never seen anything like this. I've been one of those media in the past that have been watching the Philippines to where we want, where it is. And the kind of growth that we have is there. We have a lot of investments coming in from many countries, including China. And all of this is what's propelling the economic growth in the Philippines. Real estate, of course, is number one because we have a lot of remittances coming from our overseas workers. That's about $26 to $27 billion a year.
So 26 to 7 billion.
26 to 27 billion.
Yeah. So I lied. I have one more question, but it's to end on a light note, since we've talked a lot about a lot of heavy issues. So the ambassador has a unique nickname, Jose Manuel Babe Romualdez. Where does the babe come from?
That's a good question. Well, I was a babe in the woods once. But yeah, well, actually, my mother called me that nickname because I don't know if I'm sure many of you here in this room were not born yet, but if you remember Babe Ruth, the famous baseball player, he was in the Philippines actually shortly after I was born. And so my mother, who's a baseball fan of Babe Ruth, says, I'll call you Babe. So it's good. Sometimes when women say, hi babe, and my daughter's beside me and says, who is that?
All right, well, on that note, we will open the floor to a few questions. Are we doing microphones? Yeah, so sir, just wait for a second for the microphone and just state your name and affiliation. Let us know.
Thank you very much. It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. My question was going to be also the nickname, but you asked that question. Babe Ruth was a great sort of promoter of wonderful expressions and sayings. One of the ones that I like the best is that the future ain't what it used to be. And I think that's also the case in the Philippines. This has been a very interesting interview. I'm glad that at the end of it you did focus on the economics, which is more the area that I focus in on. There's a very strong story. I was going to sort of one observation and then a question. It's not only a matter of the well north of 6% unemployment growth rate. It's a declining unemployment rate. It's a very stable inflation rate. It's a very strong current account deficit situation. It's a very strong international reserve position. There are many, many positives with the economy in the Philippines. So the question is, I think many of us who follow international trade issues have seen that in recent days the U.S. Trade Representative has spoken about more proactive Trump-era free trade area agreements, sort of something a little bit more on the positive side rather than simply trying to renegotiate agreements or levying tariffs, but something more on the positive side. And the agreement that is mentioned most strongly as the first Trump-era agreement would be with the Philippines. I wonder if the ambassador has any thoughts about that, how that might contribute to bringing the countries together, contribute to the economic growth and job creation in both countries.
Well, when President Trump came to the Philippines in November, that's one of the main subjects that was discussed with our president. We had our economic managers present during that bilateral meeting. And we could see that President Trump was very eager to have some kind of an agreement, and that's why we pursued it immediately. And we are looking at that as a way of really getting more economic activity from the United States. Many Filipinos are concerned that while you have a lot of companies operating in the Philippines, there's been very little expansion or very little investment coming in from this country to the Philippines. So we'd like to see more of that, because obviously we don't want the other country that we're having to deal with now and other issues to be dominant in the Philippines. So we value that kind of relationship, the economic relationship with the United States. And I think there's a lot of opportunities open for this country, because there is still a continuing residual goodwill for many Americans in the Philippines. It's not stopped. It has continued to be at a very high level. Filipinos, 80% of Filipinos trust Americans more than any other national.
Well, thank you for the question. Obviously, trade is forefront of many governments' minds, and it's nice to see that there's also some hope for a two-way street. So, do we have any other questions? Sure.
Hi, Roger. Thank you. This is a very interesting interview. I'm a Filipino, and I have two questions actually. The first one is, you talk about human rights. I want to say, what's your take about this anti-vaxxer issue, wherein 800,000 kids were infected, and there are already 60 plus more kids have died because of this a vaccine that was procured by the previous administration, but was really approved by the Department of Health. The second question is that you're actually affiliated with Bongbong Marcos, right? What can you say about this ongoing election protest of him who's the current Vice President of the Philippines?
Okay, well, for your first question, yes, that's being investigated, and I think that there's been a lot of accusation that the past administration was involved in some kind of anomaly there. So I think that it's been brought to the Ombudsman, which is the special prosecutor that is looking into it, and they're looking at the former president, the health secretary, and some other people who were involved in that. It was supposed to be that the money that was paid for, first of all, was overpaid. It was an overprice which they used for the elections. Which now brings us to your second question. There's a lot of questions about the results of the last elections. First and foremost, if you were following the elections in the Philippines in 2015, 16, they say that President Duterte actually won or received 21 billion votes, 5 billion short of what was supposedly counted. And there is obviously a difference, because suddenly the opposition, meaning supposedly was in fourth place, and suddenly he became number 2. Now in the case of Bongbong Marcos, I think it will be good for President Duterte if he becomes vice president, because then there'll be less opposition for him to take him out, because they don't want to see a Marcos become president again. But there's a possibility that that the counting may show that he may probably won the election, but that won't be clear until maybe about a year from now, because it takes that long to be able to to count. This is manual counting now that they're doing for the votes that were supposedly counted in favor of the current vice president.
I think we all know about close elections that we can relate to. So I think we have time if there is one more question in the back.
If you had a magic wand, what 5 U.S. corporations would you love to be doing business now?
Short and sweet.
What 5, if you had a magic wand, what are your top 5 major U.S. corporations you would love to be doing business with right now?
Well, I'm buying a lot of shopping in Amazon.
As we all are, yes.
And the owner of Amazon actually is about 3 streets away from where I stay, so I think
You're close.
Yeah.
with the way I'm spending money in Amazon, he might be able to buy another house.
Well, he's already got, I think, the most expensive property, or one of the most in DC, so you could help them out. So any other companies?
Well, we'd like to see, of course, well, the high-tech companies, we'd like to see Apple, and you know, the Philippines is one of the highest when it comes to the use of telephones, cell phones, and they go crazy every time Apple comes out with a new phone. So we're people that really love this gadgets, and that's why one of the highest users of cell phones and the social media, Facebook, the Philippines. So we'd like to see them open up in the Philippines.
So on that note, everybody like the discussion on your Facebook pages and what have you. Well, I want to, of course, thank the ambassador, and please keep an eye out for our July issue, which also features the ambassador, to get more information. Everybody please stay around. We have this beautiful venue. There will be more on the rooftop, more outside, and everybody's used to humidity, so you're gonna enjoy yourself. But thank you again, everyone, for coming. We appreciate it.